This podcast provides a platform to discuss important questions and complex issues, challenge the status quo, and confront the boundaries of the establishment. I'm retired police chief Daniel Hahn. I went from being arrested at 16 to serving over 34 years in law enforcement. My goal is to keep you informed with news not being reported, voices not being heard, and the untold history of how we got here so that we can create a way forward. Today on A Way Forward, we have Miss Jamilia Land, a mother, a wife, criminal and restorative justice activist, a public speaker, and co-founder with your husband of ASAP, which stands for Anti-Violence Safety and Accountability Project. You also currently serve on the Sacramento County Public Safety and Justice Agency Advisory Committee, which provides an ongoing forum for members of the community to directly engage with the agency on critical matters impacting the community, including managing jail populations, increasing social justice, increasing diversion efforts, reducing recidivism, and addressing racial and ethnic disparities. Jamilia is also the executive director, or executive board member of March On, which is responsible for the historic 2018 election of women to the U.S. Congress. Welcome, Jamilia.
Well, thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be here with you today.
So I was hoping you could start by talking a little bit about what made you and your husband create ASAP?
Oh, wow. Well, ASAP was birthed out of a lot of trauma and a lot of lived experience. So ASAP stands for the Anti-Violence Safety and Accountability Project. As you know, I've worked with several organizations throughout the country, focusing on community gun violence, its overall impact, the mental health effects of it, as well as officer-involved violence, including deaths. And my husband served 24 years inside of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitations, where he started a program called the 10P program while he was housed in New Folsom. On that yard, everyone was lifers. There were people who had 300, 400, 500 year sentences, multiple hundreds of points. They never were going to see the light of day outside of those walls. And there was a necessity for hope, as we've talked about, right? When there is no hope for people, there's nothing for them to drive towards. And so he started the program on the inside. Some years later, I founded a program on the outside, called Mind Change, where we focus on the mental health effects of children and their families who've been impacted by community gun violence. And he developed a theory called the theory of emotional illiteracy-based criminality, where he posits that people choose forms of criminal behavior as coping mechanisms for unprocessed childhood trauma. And so as we started building on some of these things, we said we need a place to be able to house all of this different work. And so we founded ASAP. So ASAP houses the 10P program as well as Mind Change and several of the other programs that we have embarked on in the community and inside of the carceral system.
And how do you expect that ASAP is going to help the community and families that you serve? Like, what do you do?
So that's a great question, right? So we do some of the dirty work. We go into the spaces and places that people don't want to be, and we have those conversations and provide the resources that people don't want to provide. For example, there was a shooting here a couple of years ago. Beautiful 3-year-old child was caught in the middle of what we have now come to discover. There were some gang-related issues with the family members, and someone drove by the home and shot through the windows and took the life of this 3-year-old child. We don't talk about those issues in our community. So we deal with the community violence. We go in and we talk to members of various gang organizations, and we seek to bring peace to the community. We go in and we talk to the youth. We take the youth inside of the prisons, and not on a scared straight type program, but so that they could actually sit and talk to someone who has spent 15, 20, 30 years inside of a carceral setting, to let them know what you see outside is not it. This is not where you want to be. One of our flagship programs is the Survivor Offender Mediation Seminar, were here this past December. We were fortunate enough to take inside of Lancaster Prison, maximum security prison. We took Cheryl Ward Kaiser inside to have a conversation with Lester Polk. 32 years ago, Lester and 4 of their youth broke into Cheryl's home. And might I say, Cheryl is now almost 80. She is an older white woman, and Lester and all of the youth involved in the crime were black. They broke into her home thinking that she had some money hidden for over 45 minutes. They tortured and tormented her family. They ultimately shot and killed her husband, and Lester sexually assaulted her daughter with a shotgun. They are now friends.
Wow.
Cheryl reached out and built a relationship with 4 of the 5 of them a couple of years ago. She married one of the officers who helped secure the arrest. He died, I believe it was last year, a couple of years ago. They went to the parole board and they fought to have released one of the other men in
Her and the officer husband?
Her and the officer husband.
Wow.
Went to the parole board to fight for the freedom of one of the other people involved in the crime. And so that's the type of work that we're doing. We are bringing together, we are really focusing on restorative justice, right? Because not everyone in our communities are having those honest conversations, right? We've talked about it. There's, those that say, well, we don't need law enforcement because of what we just saw with Tyree Nichols. But there are those that say, defund the police. We don't need law enforcement in our community. But then there are the same demographic of people who may not honestly come out and say it publicly, but they are in need of the services that the police department brings. When you look at it and we say, well, let's defund the police and let's put the money back into our communities and we can police ourselves. Well, I beg the question, who do I call on if someone rapes my daughter? Do I call on Mr. Johnson up the street? Does he have the capacity to actually be able to get the justice that I need? Do I call on Miss Jenkins if someone has stolen my car? What does that actually look like? And so I think having these conversations around what's really sustainable that we can duplicate has to be rooted in the thing that has disconnected us, and that's our shared humanity. And so one of the biggest things that we do is we really push forward that prisoners are people too, and that before they were offenders, they were victims of a society that has been socially constructed to continue to feed an economic engine that thrives off of the backs of Black, brown, and impoverished bodies. So,
that's something I've always respected about you is whether we agree on any particular thing or not, you're always willing to listen and you're always there to help everybody. You've done things with police, you've done things with the community. One of the things that I've always known you to do, that you still do to this day, is not just locally, but across the country, you have this amazing ability to work with families that are victims of violence and often victims of police violence. So they've lost a loved one at the hands of the police, whether the officers were arrested or not arrested, but still lost a child or a loved one at the hands of the police. So I'm just curious, quick question. Just last week we saw a video in Memphis that the Memphis Police Department released in regards to Tyree Nichols and numerous officers assaulting him, and ultimately he died. I'm just curious, when you first saw the videos, and obviously you knew those videos were coming out because they talked about it for a few days, but what was your initial reaction in seeing a video, especially as somebody that's dealt with this general thing of somebody losing a loved one at the hands of the police? What was your reaction to watching the video in Memphis?
can I really say what?
Yes, you can.
They need their ass whooped. They need their ass whooped. Because what I saw a variety of things. In my soul, I saw 5 Black men assaulting their brother. And they needed their ass whooped for that. because the Black community that I come from, that you come from, that we understand there are rules and regulations. And what they did was they reinforced the nasty negative white narrative that there's Black on Black crime, that we will violate each other in that way, that Black men are barbaric in their treatment towards one another. And then on the flip side of it, I saw Black and blue. They done lost their mind. They forgot who they are. See, because like you, and I have no shame in saying it, I have Black friends in law enforcement that I absolutely love. There's you. There's my brother Joe Ested. There's Cheryl. And the reason that I'm able to sit here and have this conversation in the first place is because of relationships with Black people who happen to have been in law enforcement, such as yourself, that never lost touch with who you are first and foremost. And so for me to see that, I was absolutely appalled. I was disgusted. You didn't have to do that. And so on the flip side, when I see the blue, I see people who got drunk with power. People who I believe, and I preface it by saying, I don't know every Black law enforcement officer in the country, right? But from those that I do know, and that I have asked some of those questions, the recurring theme that I've come to discover when I ask, what made you want to go into law enforcement? You know what I usually get? I wanted to be there to help my community. I wanted my community to be able to see a representation of themselves and feel safe. And then the next question is, well, once you got over there, what did you discover? I discovered that no matter what my intentions are, the power behind that blue wall is so much stronger than anything I could bring. So I have choices. I either assimilate, I put my head down, which is still a form of assimilation. I buck the system and run the risk of catching friendly fire. Or I buck the system, say screw it, catch friendly fire, and go out with a bang. Those are our options, because at the end of the day, it's blue. They don't see Black. And for so many of us, you know, historically, we have sought a place to fit in. And there have been only a couple of places in this socially constructed society that we live in that a Black man can have some power. That's in the pulpit as a preacher. That's with a badge on. And that's whether he's in the Army, the Navy, the Marines, or he's a law enforcement officer, right? And so we know that historically there has been a track. I remember growing up in West Oakland, and there were Black police officers. They were the coaches. They were, you know, the little league coach. They were there in the community. And so when you saw them, it wasn't the same reaction that we see today. But to get back to Tyree, what we saw was so disturbing on so many levels. But again, I look at the way Black folks handle things, right? There's always this conversation that we're not accountable to one another or our communities. We're not responsible when things happen. You know, we go running and crying. But this is the first case that I've ever seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first case I've ever seen, one, where it's a Black victim, all Black officers, and a Black female police chief. She came in and said, this is this, and this. That's that. There wasn't any sugarcoating.
Right.
And I think that that's another example of we do show up. We are accountable for one another and ourselves. But I also think that this specific killing opens up a whole nother conversation about what it is to be Black in this country, and what does it mean to be Black and blue in this country when you're policing your own communities.
For sure. And along that same line, you know, in any city across this country, I'm sure it's the same general thing. And, In Sacramento, the police department does these surveys every year. And I'm sure it's very similar in every major city across this country. In the same city, with the same police department, one community, an affluent, upper middle class community, will have a high amount of trust for law enforcement, will believe, trust, all positive things generally, or the percentage of people is much higher in that community. And then you go to the impoverished, usually a high percentage of minority families that live in that community. And the same city, the same police department, and the trust level is very low. With your experience and all the things that you've done, both in some of your positions of viewing law enforcement and viewing training, and then also you're growing up in the community and working in the community, what do you think needs to be done, or some of the things that need to be done, and the way we should be thinking about this in order to close that gap, to build trust? Because without legitimacy, we have what we often see every couple of years, protests in the street and unrest because people are frustrated and don't trust. So what do you think are some of the things that we should be thinking about and doing to change that narrative that keeps repeating itself?
You come with the questions, don't you?
I do.
It's great. I think at the core of it, we need an axiological revolution. We need to all stop and think about what we're thinking about. What do we value? What is important to us as a collective of human beings? I think that we have to actually have those hard conversations about race and racism in this country. I think that we have to have that honest conversation about the historical root of law enforcement in this country and its relationship to people of color in this country.
Now, when we do that, some people get upset.
That's okay. I don't really care if they get upset or not.
Okay. Go ahead.
But for those of them who are, anti-critical race, let's just say that we have to have a reckoning, that we have to acknowledge that this country is rooted in racism, that the founders of this country engaged in deplorable behavior against a very specific group of people, and that group of people is our ancestors, and that this country has been built off of our blood, sweat, and tears, and that we have continued to be othered. I mean, the fact that the Constitution states that we were to be deemed 3/5 of a human being for purposes of representation in a socially constructed society that we didn't construct, yet we financed, and here we are being subjected today to various forms of lynchings and whippings and torment and torture and disenfranchisement. We have to have that conversation. And when it comes to law enforcement, it's just flat out. The police in this country, their history is slave patrols. It was go out, capture the slave, bring him back.
So what would you say to people that would respond to that is, you're living in the past. That's all a long time ago. Let's move on. What's your answer to that?
My answer to that is, if you don't know your history, you can't understand your present, and you damn sure won't know what your future is going to be like. So they can say that, that's in the past. But when we can see evidence of the past living and breathing in our present, and it doesn't look like it's on life support, it's not dying anytime soon, we can just about expect that it's going to show up in our future. And so for people who don't want to believe, I don't think it's not a far stretch. We have things in our society today. There are people that are still alive today that can go back in time and say, hey, in 1898, in 1901, in 1902, this is what was happening in this country. And so for those people, I would say, if you're not going to be a part of the solution, just kind of move out of the way for those who are here who want to have the hard, honest conversations and actually do the work.
So what do you think are some of the things, even there's divide within the community itself. Mm-hmm. What do you think, after the conversation and this reckoning, what are just some of the things you think we need to do so, we don't have some of this division that I don't think if we all sat down and thought about, none of us really like law enforcement. It's not good for law enforcement. It's not good for community when folks get so upset and so frustrated and so angry that it boils over in the streets, taking over streets, burning buildings, those sort of things. Beyond the conversation, what are some of the things you think, and through ASAP and some of the other things that you are doing, need to be done in every community across this country?
Oh man, so now I get to go back into my little bag.
Okay.
And I get to share some stuff. So these are some of the things that, like, when you were the active police chief, I've spoke on some of these things, but I didn't really get to talk about them like I feel I can now, right? Because you know how it works. Like, hey, I'm out here as an activist, and what are you doing sitting there talking?
I think you've been called some names from time
Oh
to time.
man, I smell like bacon and it's not turkey. Let me tell you, I've been everything but Jamilia and a child of God, but that's okay. Because I know my purpose, and I know that somebody's got to be willing to stand in the gap, and that I would rather be obedient than to sacrifice. And so when God tells me to move a certain way, that is just what I do. And it doesn't matter if it makes sense to other people or not, because I have someone else that I answer to. So I think that people need to experience a lot of the things that you gave me and our community the opportunity to be able to experience. For example, being able to sit in on, the 2-3 day course with Dr. Tommy Thompson, right? And have community and law enforcement in that same space. You remember how I was in there? I'm like, why is she looking at me like that? Like, I don't like the way she looking, and like, you better not pull me over if I see you on the streets, But developing a relationship, right? I walked out of that room with a relationship with someone who at the time was the supervisor of gang task force. And I had a person in the community whose son was being targeted by the gang task force. And I was able to walk into your office, bring this mother in, sit down with this supervisor, have a conversation, exchange information that he then goes, oh my God, I had no clue this is what this young man was experiencing. So now let's shift the way that we as the police department come to interact with him. And now she has a different viewpoint. So we were able to finally bring everyone together. And now the child not running from the police every time he sees them, and the police aren't chasing after him every time they see him. And the mom's not worried about what, at least with some, right? She doesn't have to worry about some of those things, right? Because there is that bridge. And then there are opportunities like being able to bring the youth into the academy, and letting them go through the use of force simulator, so that they can see in real time what is actually happening. Being able to get into the helicopter and take a ride and see the city and see officers in a different light, but the officers being able to see these youth as a different light. It blew my mind. We got a kid on an ankle monitor getting into a police helicopter to take a tour around the city. You know what I mean? And when he's all said and done, he's gone from, hey, I was running from the police before. I'm 15 years old. I'm on an ankle monitor. This is what's going on in my life. But thank you for introducing me to the chief of police. He's really cool. Like, whoa, and he's black. And he's like, he was listening to Tupac, and like, whoa. Now this kid wants to do something positive with his life and be able to give back to a kid who looks like him based upon that interaction. And so I think, and I'm just one person, you're just one person, right? But if we could actually build a culture where we could do that. And then there's something unique. You're here from this community. You were born and raised here. These are your streets. These are your people. You've never been shy. You've never been afraid of that. You don't have any reservations about, I'm black first. I'm from Oak Park first. And these are my people, whether I'm in this uniform or not. So let's make the best of what we have. And I think that's a part too of why you weren't well received, because people didn't understand. And that was also a part of why I was like, y'all not about to mess with my dog.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is sharing experiences, understanding a little bit about each other that maybe you wouldn't have had experience to be able to meet with other people, and folks getting to know each other and understanding each other's challenges and all those sort of things is a big part of the solution.
We have to humanize one another. I think at the end of the day, of all the boxes that we get to check off on all the paperwork in life, the one that's never there is human. And when we can start to humanize one another, when a law enforcement officer can look at me, when a white male law enforcement officer, and I say that because statistically we know that more than 50% of law enforcement in this country is a white male, right? So when a white male officer looks at me, he doesn't see what Instagram says or what Fox News may have put up or what some TV show. He actually sees Jamilia, a mother, a wife, a community, person. But we don't get to have that unless, one, he's willing to step into the circle, or he's under the tutelage of someone who says, you're going to go step in that circle whether you like it or not, and I hope to change your hearts and mind. And by the way, take this book with you. And people such as myself who are willing to step into the circle and say, hey, I don't have much trust, but I'm going to stand in this space and I'm going to open up to try to have this dialogue in hopes that something different can come about. Because if you never show up, you never know what the possibilities could be. Who knew that, 5 years later, we would be sitting here and we would be able to have these conversations.
I definitely didn't know that.
Yeah, I know you thought I was batshit crazy. It was like, she about to kill me up here. And I'm like, hey, how you doing? Yeah.
Yeah, I was a little worried. So thank you very much for joining us on A Way Forward. But I want to end with you just saying if you touch somebody today on this podcast and they want to help in the work that you do, whether it's restorative justice or helping families connect and helping people reintegrate into the community, how can they help ASAP or any of the work that you do?
Oh, that is a great question. So that's twofold for me. On one side, people can reach out to me. They can email me at Jamilia, Jamilia, at asapjustice.network. We are always open for resources, donations. But what I really, 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 really want for people, I don't care if I ever get a dime for anything, because I know the God that I serve and he always makes provision for my life. If I could just get one something through to people, it is this. Please start looking at your fellow human being as a human being. Remove what you think you might see. Remove all of the socially constructed stereotypes and see someone who loves, someone who hurts, someone who cries, someone who laughs, someone who has someone that they're connected to in this world that loves them. See them as your fellow human being and love them that way. That's what I want people to do. And then I think we'll be a better world.
I couldn't agree more. So I think the philosopher. Thank you. And I think we'll close on that.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
One of the big purposes of A Way Forward is to hear different voices and different opinions, because that is how we can make informed decisions ourselves. So if you are someone that would like to come on A Way Forward to express your opinion, go to chiefhahn.com/podcast. chiefhahn.com/podcast.